and good morning, wherever you're in Canada, and welcome to the first session of CSPC Career Campus. Bonjour et bienvenue à la première séance de la nouvelle série Campus de Carrière. Before beginning, I would like to acknowledge the land where I am talking from in Richmond Hill, Ontario. This is the traditional land of Wenda and the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe peoples, whose presence here continues to this day. We would thank them and other Indigenous people for sharing this land with us. We at CSPC are so excited to begin the Career Campus series. We have been thinking about this series to start and to plan for a long time. As you know, the capacity building and training of the new generation of science policy experts has always been one of the important pillars of the CSPC. Career Campus series will have two different styles. One is a panel session and panel discussion format where early and mid-career professionals will discuss their careers with you. And this format, the current session is one of those. And the second style will be the Meet the Executives, where we will bring the executives of various organizations to share their story, their career trajectory story with you and exchange ideas with the participants. We are planning to have one of every style every month, and the first of the Meet the Executive session will be announced soon, where we have Dr. Rob Anand, the president of Genome Canada, will be having a kind of casual and interactive discussion with you. These sessions will be led and moderated by CSPC volunteers, and I would like to ask for this session, the CSPC Event Committee Co-Chair, Aya Abdelayam, to lead the session. Aya is a PhD candidate in University of Toronto in the field of drug discovery and chemical biology. And before that, I want to thank all the participants and leave the stage for Aya. Over to you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Mehrdad, for the introduction, and thank you everyone for joining us here today for our first career panel session. We hope that throughout this entire series that we're able to introduce you to some of the careers here available in science policy, and then you get to ask some questions to some of the professionals in the space. Just a few quick notes before we get started. The first half of the session up until the end of the general Q&A is being recorded. So keep that in mind if you do choose to turn your camera on or do choose to turn your mic on as well. We will be posting the video to the CSPC website. We will be stopping the recording just before the audience Q&A. So if you'd like to turn on your camera at that point, please feel free to do so. We ask that you keep your mic muted at all times just to prevent any distractions from the speakers. And just at the end of this session, as I mentioned, we will be doing a Q&A. So feel free to leave your questions throughout the session in the chat, or at the end, at the audience Q&A section, you can use the raise hand function so that you can unmute yourself and ask your question yourself. Again, thank you so much to all the speakers for taking the time to be their time out of their day to be with us here today. I'm sure you're all very busy. And before jumping into some of the questions, I'm just going to quickly introduce some of the panelists we have here today. So our first panelist is Dr. Lisa Chen Obrist. Dr. Lisa started at CFI in 2015 as a program officer and subsequently joined the Performance Analytics and Evaluation team as a senior evaluation analyst in 2016. After working for Parliament for several years, she did go back to complete her PhD at the University of Toronto at the History of Philosophy and Medieval Science and Medicine. Dr. Shweta Ganapati, who joined NSERC as a MITAX Canadian Science Policy Fellow in 2020. She has since been working on the broad range of policy priorities at NSERC, as well as taking on a few key international files, including the European Union and Germany. Before joining NSERC, Shweta was actually served as the program manager here at Canadian Science Policy Centre and the research scientist at the Maryland-based biotech startup. Our third panelist is Dr. Francois Palantia, who is currently at the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, also known as SSHRC. He holds a PhD in history from the University of Montreal and Paris. His research focuses on the relationship between governments and businesses and the formulation of new energy policies and international relations. Since completing his PhD, he has published and participated in multiple conferences on different subjects linked to economic history, such as government regulation, trade policy, strategic planning, and natural resources. And our final panelist, Dr. Uzma Urooj, has a PhD in cognitive neuroimaging from the University of York. And she has also bachelor's honors in neuroscience and linguistics from the University of Toronto, Canada. Following her PhD training, Uzma gained professional experience in the research management, technology transfer, and subsequently science policy. She currently works as a senior advisor of science strategist at the Canadian Institute of Health Research, also known as CIHR, and where she's intimately involved with the interface of science and policy. So again, thank you all for joining us today, and we'll start with some of the general Q&A for the session. We'll go around, I'll propose the questions, and then maybe we can all go around and you can give some of your thoughts and feedbacks on the questions that we proposed. So I'll start by asking everyone, in terms of your introduction into the science policy space, particularly into the granting agency, did you know that this was the kind of job that you wanted to pursue while you were exploring your background areas of study? And what was the most contributing factor, do you think, in securing a science policy career for you? Maybe we can start with Shweta. You want to try to take one question?
Thanks, Aya. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be a part of this inaugural Career Cafe this afternoon. As Aya just introduced me, I'm a MIDAC Science Policy Fellow and Policy Analyst. I work for NSERC. And in terms of whether I knew while pursuing my PhD if I wanted to work for a granting council and work in science policy, the answer is no. I was not even aware of science policy careers for scientists at the time. I went into my PhD at the University of Maryland in the field of chemistry, thinking I wanted to be a professor. I loved research. I wanted to teach. So that was the dream with which I went in. But around midway in graduate school, I got involved with a graduate student government, and I started organizing a career series similar to this one that I'm now part of, and inviting our alumni back to the university to talk about the careers they were in. And that's when we had a representative from NSF, the National Science Foundation in the US, come in and talk about their career path. And that's how I became aware of science policy as a space where scientists can contribute. And so even after that, it took me a few years to get into this position. So right after graduating, my first position was actually as a research scientist at a startup. And I just got into that position because it was a startup company run by a professor who was on my thesis committee, and my research kind of correlated very well with the expertise they needed. And then I kind of had a shift in my kind of personal and professional life where I actually moved countries. I moved from the United States to Canada. And when I moved to Canada, I decided that, for my next career step, I wanted to be very conscious. And I really asked myself, what do I want to do? Where do I want to contribute? How much do I enjoy working in the lab? And I realized that there were certain skills that I felt I had and I felt I wanted to exercise, and I wasn't really able to do that in the lab, one of which was communication skills, interpersonal skills, building relationships, working with different stakeholders. I really loved whatever little taste of that I got in my other roles, and I wanted to do more of that. And I also, had an interest in policy for science and was actually doing some work on that kind of in my own free time. So when I moved to Canada, one of the first things I did was I started volunteering with the Canadian Science Policy Center. When I found this organization, I was really excited because it was a very easy entry for me into the world of science policy. I could just volunteer. I could be with a group of like-minded people. And that was really my introduction to science policy. Before that, I wasn't sure how to enter into this space. But once I did, I met a lot of like-minded people. I met a lot of mentors along the way. Uzma was on this panel as one of them. And then I learned about the MIDAC Science Policy Fellowship. I met some of the fellows at CSPC 2019, the annual conference, and I applied for the program. And that's how I got into my current role.
Just to quickly, I think I might have sped up the events a bit, but I think the first part will actually just be going around and getting a bit of a background introduction on each of the panelists. And I think, Shweta, you did a great job of that. Uzma, do you want to go next?
Yeah, no problems. So hi, everyone. Thank you for inviting me. It feels like coming home all the time, every single time I'm involved or doing anything through the CSPC platform, and this being no exception. So as Aya has already introduced me, I currently work at the Canadian Institutes for Health Research as a senior advisor for science strategies in the science policy branch at CIHR. CIHR is one of the 3 research funding agencies in Canada. And as the name suggests, it funds health research. In my particular role, I develop quite a lot of national strategies. I implement those strategies as well mostly around how to support and train the next generation of researchers. That includes trainees, early career researchers, in fact, the entire research pipeline. And I spend a lot of time thinking about how best to uphold research excellence within the research ecosystem. Now, going back to the question that I had asked on whether I knew this is where I wanted to end up in, I think my answer would be slightly different than Shweta. I think I subconsciously did know that I'm not going to stay in the mainstream or grant-led research academia. The reason being because when I was doing my PhD, I think really early on during my PhD, I was involved in setting up the newly funded York Neuroimaging Center. When I say York, I do not mean University of York here in Canada. It's a University of York in the UK. And that was at that time one of the only 2 places in the entire UK that had a neuroimaging center. Instead of spending a lot of time on working on my own research project, I was spending a lot more time looking for multiple funding avenues to sustain the center. I was part of the steering committee, and I was also one of the first PhD students for the Neuroimaging Center. So I was doing a lot of overall governance structures related activities. I was creating processes for the center, including developing protocols, policies, guidance documents. I was also doing a lot of leading these training workshops to allow my colleagues and other departments get to understand and know more about the Neuroimaging Center, including cost implications associated with each experimental setup. And I think that's where I knew that I was not meant for mainstream grant-led, research that was going to be led by me. I was more enjoying the facilitation of research. In fact, a crucial point that I want to highlight in this space is the fact that my supervisor had figured out my broader interests, perhaps even before I was willing to admit it to myself. He had hinted several times around exploring options outside of traditional grant-led research. So a tip to anyone who's doing their PhDs, please pay attention to what your supervisors are telling you. Sometimes they can see the bigger picture and are able to look at the bigger, take a bit, I guess, a more broader lens than sometimes we are as trainees. So it was no surprise to anyone that before submitting my thesis, I had already reached out to the Technology Transfer Office at the University of York and had started working there. I started off with a contract with 6 months that got increased to a year. And I was helping these research projects that had a potential for commercialization and moving them along. I subsequently moved on to managing large-scale multi-collaborative research projects at University of Leeds, and then subsequently when I returned back to Ottawa here in Canada at University of Ottawa, both at pre and post-award level. I was managing budgets, creating governance processes, developing collaborative relationships, partnerships, basically doing everything and anything related to research facilitation and management rather than actual research itself. All of these experiences helped me see, I think personally, it helped me grow my understanding of how research is done very well as well. I began to see the importance of translation and application of science in the real world. I started noticing that scientific knowledge, when managed and leveraged properly, can be a great asset for the society as a whole. A critical experience during this entire time, I feel, was also my involvement and volunteering with the Canadian Science Policy Center. So I, alongside Shweta, are the co-chairs currently for the evaluation committee, but I have been involved with CSPC for almost 6 years now, including co-chairing the program committee for a couple of years. So when I returned back from the UK and I was on maternity break at that time, I was looking for organizations where I could volunteer for a few hours just to remain in touch with my career. And that's how I got involved with CSPC. Because of my natural inclination, I was looking for a platform to understand the Canadian science policy landscape. And because I had international experiences, I feel like I was already kind of tuned to asking these questions for myself. How is science done differently between Europe and Canada? What are we doing here that was not being done in the UK, and vice versa? So there was a lot of those questions and those observations that I was making as I was involved. I think I'm still involved with CSPC. I feel that it's a great organization in that sense to broaden my horizons, but expand the professional network and gain a nuanced understanding of the Canadian science policy landscape. It was during my work at the University of Ottawa, which was the first place where I re-entered after my maternity break, where a colleague of mine actually mentioned applying to government. I had no ideas about applying to government. So I knew that I was not going to stay in academia, but I did not necessarily knew that I was going to end up in government. And that came because one of my supervisors at the time mentioned that government, his wife was applying, so he had mentioned that there is a certain process for government applications that is taken. And he kind of led me through that process. And I was intrigued because that process was so different than anything that I had heard or that I would usually take for applying for positions in academia or university setting or private sector setting. And so I guess out of curiosity, I applied to a couple of positions based on some of the tips that he had provided on the cover letter or the resume and how to set and position those cover letter and resumes. And it kind of worked out. I got my first position at NSERC as a program officer, where I was mostly delivering PhD and PDF programs. And from there onwards, I didn't stay long at NSERC. I moved quickly from NSERC to CIHR. And the reason was simply because I was missing the ability to apply my critical thinking skills. So program delivery is one aspect, but then strategy development or using a lot of that strategy and vision development was something that I was missing. So I moved to CIHR in the science strategies team, and I've been here for the last 4 years now. I find that what I love about my career in government is the ability to work on big problems that affect the lives of next generation of scientists in both ways, tangible and sometimes very subtle ways to bring out the culture change. And that's how, and that's where I am today. I'll stop here and we can take on some questions later.
Yeah, thank you so much, Uzma. Francois, do you want to do a brief intro as well?
Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me. To build up on what was being said at the beginning, I have a background in history. I did a bachelor, master's, and PhD and focused on international relations, economic history. I finished in 2016. After that, I worked for a while as an editor and a writer for an editing company. I worked publishing history books for teaching. From there, I moved on, tried to branch off and join a business school where I did a few contracts. First, postdoctoral research contract on business history. So I was sort of making links with my own background. And through networking, I learned about the MyTax Fellowship, for which I applied, and it allowed me to join SSHRC in 2019, so part of that year's cohort. And after joining SSHRC, I was involved for a year in the renewal of the agency's strategic plan, which was released last year in the fall, in October. So working there on that strategy was just a great experience. I was able to make links between having studied public policies from an historical perspective, and now having a hand in the forming of policies in real time. So it was a great opportunity. Following the release of that strategy, I've also been involved in different files, the main ones being international, so research partnerships, for example, with other countries. I've also more recently been involved with the official languages file. And lastly, the question of accessibility in our programs. So that's my main trajectory. To answer, like my colleagues, the first question that was asked, if I had an idea of what kind of job I wanted when I started my studies, the short answer is no. And as I got around, I would say the master's level, I was sort of stuck in the mindset, which is for most people in academia, that I would end up teaching. And hence, I think how useful this workshop is, because a lot of us don't see the opportunities that lie outside of academia. And similarly to Shweta, it's thanks to networking, talking with people, that I learned about the MyTax Fellowship, which allowed me to get my current job. So I would say that was networking, as much as I'm not a fan, is an absolutely great way to learn about new opportunities. It's definitely been a major contributing factor for me. And I think I will stop there for the introduction.
Lisa?
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Aya, for inviting me. And I'm very happy to be participating on the panel today. So just to add to the brief introduction from before, to tell you a little bit more about how I ended up at the Canada Foundation for Innovation. And then I'll briefly answer the question. So I did an undergraduate degree and a master's degree at McGill University in history. And then after that, decided to work for a few years. I came back to Ottawa. I'm originally from Ottawa, so I came back to Ottawa and worked on Parliament Hill. During those few years, it was working at the Library of Parliament, so in public education and outreach area. But it gave me the chance to see the legislative side of government and how policies are put into practice in some ways, and then how policies are developed from the beginning in other ways. After a few years, I always had it in the back of my mind that I was very still interested in continuing education and going back, and I decided I did want to learn more. I wasn't finished learning more about medieval history, which was what interested me the most. So I went to the University of Toronto to the Center for Medieval Studies there in their PhD program. While I was still completing my thesis at U of T, I actually started working for SSHRC, for the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. And so I could sort of say that my career at the funding agency started before I finished my studies. What I did was started at SSHRC on a student summer contract. So this is another option for students to look into, working for government agencies, government departments, and even organizations that aren't necessarily directly related to government, but are in the area of your interest, is to look for short-term opportunities to not only work, but to learn from the inside about the different type of work that goes on in these organizations. So I did quite a few part-time contracts with SSHRC while I was completing my doctorate. And then after I finished my thesis, I had a few full-time contracts with SSHRC. So this was both in the areas of corporate strategy and performance, and also in programs. Then, after about a year and a half of working for SSHRC, I applied for a contract at the Canada Foundation for Innovation. So I started there in started here in 2015 as a programs officer. So I worked in that area for a year, and while I was completing that contract, I applied for a permanent position with the Performance Analytics and Evaluation team at CFI, and so started doing that in 2016. So with my current position, I went back to doing more corporate strategy, performance, reporting, as well as looking at policies and analyzing policy implications for the funding programs that CFI delivers. And it allowed me to stay in touch with many colleagues from SSHRC and get to know many new colleagues from NSERC and CIHR, as there is a lot of interagency work that goes on. And one of the areas that I do now that I did not foresee being involved in when I started doing my studies and started working at the agencies is the equity, diversity, and inclusion policy area. And because that is an area that is of a priority area for all of the agencies, that is how I get to do a lot of my interagency work. To go back to the question of did I think I would end up working in the funding area at all? Not necessarily. I did not think when I went back to doing my PhD that I'd end up working for SSHRC or CFI. I did, though, know from my previous work experiences that there were opportunities to work at the federal government level in areas that support research and funding and support scientific endeavors, and that someone with a background in higher education, especially at the graduate level and in research, would have the background knowledge and the skills to be able to work in the administration of research. So that was one sort of notion that got me through completing my PhD, is that even though I wasn't interested, I sort of knew early on in my PhD that I wasn't as interested in the teaching side as I was in the research side. So I knew that I probably wouldn't be pursuing sort of a traditional tenure track position in academia. But through my studies and my volunteer work with the associations on campus, I knew that for every tenured track professor there is at a university, there are many other people that work in research administration, either at the institutions, at the provincial government level, or at the federal government level. So I was aware that there would be many opportunities to work in related fields, but as I said before, how I actually got into working for the agencies was through a summer contract with SSHRC. So I'll leave it at there and let Aya take back the questions.
Yeah, so thank you so much for sort of blending in your intros to the first question there. I think that kind of got everything moving really nicely. Just to go into the second question, what does a typical workday look like for you? And was it sort of what you expected, or was it something entirely different? We can just go around if anyone wants to start off first. Shweta, maybe you can start.
Sure, I'm happy to take this one as well. So within NSERC, so NSERC's mandate is to fund national sciences and engineering research in Canada, and we basically cater to the universities and colleges and all the faculty, students, and postdoctoral fellows there. So within NSERC, I actually work in the policy and international relations team. And the bulk of my work is actually in the international relations side. So the goal here is to manage NSERC's international partnerships and relationships with agencies in other countries. And so our work in this team is divided by country files. And some of the country files that I'm in charge of are Germany, India, and the European Union. And so in that context, what I end up doing, broadly speaking, is I liaise between these international agencies and other divisions within NSERC. So NSERC has a research grants and partnerships and research partnerships division who are actively involved in program development and program delivery, but we manage their kind of international relationships with similar agencies abroad. We also work with other Canadian government departments and agencies. We work a lot with CIHR and SSHRC, so the tri-agencies often work together. I often encounter François in my day-to-day work on these files. We also work with Global Affairs Canada, and sometimes our work involves representing NSERC at high-level meetings between Canada and other countries. So that is kind of the big picture of the international relations work that I do. Some other things that I've had the opportunity to get involved with at NSERC have been the discovery grants review process. So the discovery grants are sort of NSERC's biggest investment into research. It's a huge production. For the first time in 2021, this review process was held online, and I had the opportunity to support the program officers who delivered this peer review process. And fantastic learning experience. NSERC also has a lot of MITAC science policy fellows. We had 3 of us who joined in 2020, and we also had Sean McGurk who joined a few years ago as a fellow. And so we have our science policy brainstorm sessions that we host within NSERC, bringing, basically everybody at NSERC is invited to just talk about different science policy issues, and it really is a brainstorm and kind of taking things apart and looking at them critically. So this is some of the type of work I do or I try to accomplish. And in terms of the nitty-gritty of the day-to-day, I feel like a lot of my work is developing some sort of a communication product. So there's a lot of, writing briefing notes, briefing emails, making sure all of the stakeholders who are part of any given project are all in the loop. They all know what's happening, and getting their involvement and their cooperation in moving these projects forward. So a lot of writing, if there's an event coming up, preparing slide decks, that type of thing. Sometimes I also do environmental scans, try to understand the state of research in a particular field, who are the NSERC funded researchers, that type of thing. It actually reminds me a lot of literature reviews that I used to do as a research student. And then, of course, there's a lot of attending meetings. Everything is virtual, so a lot of internal meetings within NSERC, meeting with other Canadian departments and agencies, meeting with international stakeholders, attending events that are relevant to my work, preparing summaries, and once again, bringing in that feedback into my team and helping in developing a bigger kind of international strategy for NSERC. So those are the types of things that happen on a day-to-day basis. And one thing which I try to do, because I'm so new to this world of the public sector, I only started at NSERC in August last year, is to just set up a lot of coffee chats and just get to know people within NSERC, within the tri-agencies, within the Canadian government, and just all of the people who, with whom I cross paths during my work. I just try to set up meetings and get to know them more. And I consider that to be a part of my work, actually, because it really helps drive things forward.
Uzma or Lisa, maybe you can go and then we can follow up with Uzma and Francois.
Sure, yes, thanks. Well, one aspect of my work at CFI is that every day I get to do things that look at the very big picture and look at the very small picture. And one of the reasons for that is the size of CFI. So we're a fairly small organization, less than 100 people. And that has given me the opportunity to interact with colleagues outside of my own unit on a daily basis, learn about the business of all the other departments as well. And what I mean by look at the big picture as well as the small is that our group feeds into all of the sort of corporate level reporting that CFI does to ISED and to our external stakeholders. So I could be looking at analyzing and writing reports that talk about all of the activities that CFI is involved with and all of our funding programs. And then a few hours later, I might be talking to a project leader who led one of the CFI funded projects at our institutions, and asking them about the the research outcomes of their particular project and their particular lab. So it's very interesting to see in any given day the different levels of research impact, and speaking with people that are doing the research and using the research in different ways and with different populations. I did not really expect to have that type of variety in the job that I do, but as I said before, CFI, because of its size and the fact that we fund projects across all disciplines, has given me a very good variety of not only content of what I do, but also the types of tasks. And the other thing, as I mentioned before, is the interagency work. So CFI works very closely with the tri-agencies, and because it's a particular type of work that interests me, I've been able to get experience working on different interagency committees and participating with colleagues at conferences. And that has certainly helped me in my own work, but also helped me learn about the work that my colleagues in the other agencies do as well. Thanks.
Thank you. Francois, do you want to maybe take a shot at that question as well?
Yes. So a lot of my responsibilities are actually echo Shweta's at the eye level. I think what might be more specific to SSHRC is I get to do a lot of multitasking, as I mentioned, working on official languages, on accessibility and international. These are very different things, but I found it's also great because it's allowing me to make links between these files that without this knowledge I might not be able to do. For example, thinking about official languages, but linking that to international. So what all that means on a daily basis is a lot of reading, writing briefings, definitely a lot of liaison activities. As Shweta mentioned, we do talk once in a while, not only with the tri-agencies, but also with other federal government agencies. And that can be not only for international, but other files as well. So to go back to the question, is it what I expected? I would say not really. It's more interesting than what I expected, because the agencies are the center, of that research ecosystem. So they do get to play a huge role in that ecosystem, and just to be able to contribute to those policies, to shape them in a minor way is and the files themselves are very interesting. It's not something that you understand from the get-go when you're a researcher and you have that external perspective as someone who does research proposals to get funded. I did not necessarily add that view of the agencies as shapers of the ecosystem rather than strictly funders of research, and that has really it's been a very nice surprise.
Uzma, you want to answer that question?
Yeah, so I think I would definitely want to echo what the last point that Francois has mentioned about what is expected or what is generally assumed of these funding agencies or any work within the government. And that is considered a very narrow, just giving out grants, just managing them. But it's actually a lot more than that. There's definitely the influencers, the shapers, the facilitators, but also creating that vision. So that kind of role that governments play, especially these funding agencies, but also broadly across the different organizations within the government. And that's yet another point that I want to highlight as well, that public service is a very big space with so much to do. So depending on what your inclinations are, there's so many different directions that you can take and your career in. And I think that's that's something that I wasn't expecting or did not know much about when I joined the government or the public service space. It really truly feels like public service in the truest sense of the word, where you are actually trying to understand the pulse of what the society's needs are, what the ecosystem's needs are, in your subject matter expertise. In our cases, it's a research ecosystem, and then trying to figure out how you can influence them, how you can shape them, but how you can move them forward and move them along with other. So because we are in the federal funding agencies, move them along with other entities and stakeholder groups, for example, the provincial funding agencies or health charities, because I work for the CIHR. So we work really closely with the not-for-profit organizations like Genome Canada, obviously CFI, tri-agencies, but also health charities and a lot of the NAFRO organizations, which are at the provincial level. So there's a lot of ways that you can influence this space. And there's a lot of different science policy topics that you can literally become the expert in, but at the same time have the flexibility to maneuver across different agencies, which is something that I learned once I joined the government's or the public service space. So I think this is how the work differs between the university setting, which is primarily focused on governance-related policies. I did a lot of policy development there as well, but only for those research networks or research or programs that I was involved for. But here at CIHR, I have worked on the science policy topics, such as, so I lead the training and career development file. That includes the training strategies, the ECR strategies, in fact, taking a holistic approach across the entire research pipeline. But I also work on the research excellence files. I also work on, and there's obviously the cross-cutting impacts and constant discussions around EDI and systemic racism that impacts and affects every one of us. I also work through the science strategies team very closely with the CIHR Institute. So remember that CIHR is actually has satellite institutes, 13 of them, all spread all across Canada, through which we can reach further down within the niche communities. So for example, ICRH will reach into the circulatory and respiratory health research system. ISPER, in the health and public policy system. So there's different ways that you can interact with them, and there are different levels that you interact with different teams. And I think that's the biggest thing in terms of my day-to-day activity. Which was the first part of the question. I spend a lot of time networking, but a lot of time managing stakeholders, speaking to different tables and representing CIHR at different organizations, but at different levels, to understand what the environment is telling us. There's a lot of consultations. There are a lot of consensus building exercises. Understanding the needs and the challenges of each particular group. For example, health professional scientists are a niche group within the trainees who have their specific requirements and needs. And that's just one example. There are so many other different groups. And so just kind of reaching out to them, understanding what their needs are, and then bringing that information back to develop strategic directions in the short term, medium term, long term, and also as everyone and all of my colleagues over here have mentioned, developing a lot of these well-informed, evidence-based recommendations to senior management in various formats, but also externally to other stakeholders, to people who you're working with, and then further externally to outside to the public world. So there's a lot of work that requires scientific literature synthesis, environmental scans, developing pilot studies, developing recommendations, and doing a lot of these risk analysis, comparative analysis, and then to the other end, looking at the programs that have already been launched by CIHR and seeing what their performance looks like. So making, doing a lot of these performance indicators to understand how these programs are impacting, but where the gaps still exist, so we can fill those gaps. You would have noticed recently developed funding opportunity, the health research training platform. So I was part of that program on training. So there's a lot of these developing funding programs and funding opportunities and then assessing them, assessing their success.